When you think of successful kids shows, you might think of some shows like Dragon Tales or Sesame Street. But the number one greatest preschool show, in my opinion, would be Thomas the Tank Engine. So, to celebrate my second year of being on YouTube, I decided to take a little history on this little blue tank engine. I want you to keep in mind that I'm only going to talk about the main sources of Thomas, so I'm not going to bother with too much on the spin-offs like the Jack in the Pack or Tugs. I'm mainly going through the TV shows, some of the changes that they made, and what others that Thomas has been through from the past and what he's been through now. So sit back, get your tickets ready, as we take on a long journey for Thomas the Tank Engine. In the early 1940s, a man named the Reverend Wilbur Awdry was the man responsible for Thomas. In 1943, when his son, Christopher Awdry, was sick with measles, he told him a bedtime story, which was about railways and talking trains. His first engine that popped in his head was Edward, the Blue Engine. After he wrote the stories in the book, so he can read them to his son again, his wife, Margaret, suggested the idea of publishing the book and make more to sell them to other people. The Reverend W. Awdry agreed, but some publishers were not impressed by it and rejected the idea, till he finally found someone that would publish the book if he could make a final story where Henry gets out of the tunnel. The Reverend agreed, and thus the first railway series was born, called The Three Railway Engines. When the book came out, it was first illustrated by William Minton, then later by C. Reginald Daly. During the same year that the book was being published, Christopher wanted a model of Gordon, but it would be much too hard for the Reverend to do. So instead, he decided to make a tank engine for him, and this was the engine that would become known as Thomas the Tank Engine, and it was Christopher that gave it the name. He also asked his father if he could make a book all about Thomas, and that's just what his father did, and was made, and it was published in 1946. This will be the first book to have a foreword in the beginning of each book. If you don't know what that is, it's like a little open letter that will be in a book or a movie before it starts. Like the Three Railway Engines, it was illustrated by Reginald Daly. Then, again, it was published by C. Reginald Daly. Later, C. Reginald would be the illustrator for the Railway series books, but he and the Reverend didn't get along very well. I'll get into more on that later. As time went on, the Reverend Awdry would soon make one Railway series book each year, starting in 1948 with James the Red Engine. Not only that, but the books would later be told with some stories of something that did happen on the real railway, like the drivers and guards going on strike. And the stories would continue from where previous stories left off, and have hints that were featured in later books, like Henry kept being sick in Thomas the Tank Engine and Tank Engine Thomas again. Later, in Henry the Green Engine, it was because that the coal was wrong, and he had to be given special coal, but it was later fixed in the Flying Kipper. During the year 1952, the Reverend would soon be volunteering at a railway called the Tallyflin Railway, where he wrote a book about this place and called it the Skarloey Railway. The Reverend would mention the Tallyflin Railway in his 14th book, The Little Old Engine, where he said that Skarloey is not really real, but there is a real engine that is just like Skarloey. During the time that Percy the Small Engine was being published, the Reverend Awdry was upset with Daly because of the way he made Percy, saying that he looks like a green caterpillar with red stripes. So Daly quit his work with the Reverend, and so the Reverend hired a new illustrator named John T. Kennedy, and he got along with the Reverend way more better than Daly, because John made the pictures more realistic and exciting, Also, when John was illustrating the 12th book, The 8 Famous Engines, the Reverend wanted this to be his final book for the series, but the publishers did not want him to stop and urged him to continue on. So he did, and he made some more new Railway Series books, and in 1958, he released his 13th book, Duck and the Diesel Engine. This book would be the first book that would have a villain in the series named Diesel, but the Reverend did not want to make all diesel engines villains, so he made some good ones, like Rusty, Daisy, Bear, and Boko. In 1952, when Galileo Engine was being released, John T. Kennedy was suffering from poor eyesight and was about to go blind, so he thought it would be best if he retired from the Railway Series and honorably walked away. So the Reverend had to find some more new illustrators for the book, to which he found two, Gardner and Peter Edwards. When editor Eric Minton was looking for some new publishers after John T. Kennedy retired, he asked a woman called Gardner if she was willing to do it. She kindly said yes and tried her best to do so, but she was having really hard time with the small spaces that she had to work with for the books. So she turned to her husband, Peter, and helped out the best he can. When they were finished, both Eric and Audrey were satisfied with the pictures they drew, and were now the new publishers for the Railway Series, starting with Stephanie, the Bluebell Engine. During the early 60s, the writing for the books became more and more harder for the Reverend to write. So he did the same thing on what he did with the Skarloey Railway, make some more books based on real railways and real events that happened before. So he went to another railway, called the Snowdown Mountain Railway, which will be called the Caldy Fell Railway. There's another book that would feature another real-life railway. In England, was called the Reverend Glass and Erskdale Railway, and again, in the books, it will be called the Archdale Railway. In 1971, while the 26th book was about to come out, this was the book that gave the Reverend Audrey such a hard time for. For one thing, this was the book that was really hard for him to make the pictures. So in 1972, this will be the Reverend Audrey's final Railway Series book. Although the Reverend stopped making the Railway Series, he didn't fully stop just yet. He made two new Thomas books in 1979 and 1980, which were known as Thomas Annuals. And although he stopped writing, this was not the last Railway Series book that would be made. It took over 10 years to make a new Railway Series book. Then finally, in 1983, the 27th Railway Series book was published, called Really Useful Engines. And this time, the books will have a new author, and that author was none other than Christopher Audrey, and a new illustrator named Cleve Spun.